our chalice lighting words. We gather this hour as a people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's nice to be back. Somehow the rotation of Sundays has been off a little bit, so I think it's been since before the summer that I was able to be with you, so glad that that's changed. I'll be back in December. As Emily's meditation reminded us, we all have a lengthy line of ancestors that go back in time. Some of the ones that were described by Emily, the kind crawling the earth long ago before any human beings ever arrived. The rest of us, of course, coming from more recent occupants of the planet. Each of us from a long line of ancestors, some of whom we know something about and some who always will remain to us somehow as strangers. But we imagine we know them. You all probably have folks who are your ancestors you can think of, and you know them through a story or a legend that's been passed down amongst the family, or an anecdote, or maybe a portrait or a photograph that exists of some little child in the 1890s on a toy bicycle or something, and you know them for who you think they might be. Or at least you know a version of them. But of course, much is lost to memory, or sometimes intentionally even edited out, to make those ancestors into something that they weren't, or who perhaps someone that we wished they might be. I have one of those kind of relatives. He was my Uncle Otis. He was my great uncle, my beloved grandmother's only brother. And he was one of those ancestors, and I guess almost every family has at least one, who was written out of the family story. I was in my 20s, I think, when I learned that he existed, that he had been a part of the family, and in fact was still alive. He was an alcoholic. He lived in a boarding house in Utica and had a long history of scrapes with the law. And for me, having heard the history of my family, I thought, well, how could such a nice family do such a thing to one of their own? How could they let that happen? No one really had an answer. And then another 10, 15 years later, I happened to come across some things after my grandmother died, and one of them was some diaries of their mother, my great-grandmother, telling about life in this little town in the Mohawk Valley in the teens. And I learned a little bit about my Uncle Otis then, more than I learned from anyone else. He was the family golden boy. Valedictorian of his high school. A beautiful tenor singing voice. My great-grandmother Gertrude would write every Sunday when he had a solo in church and tell how well he did. He was handsome. He went to Dartmouth. He studied landscape architecture. And he drank. And when he got back from college, time after time, he humiliated his small town family. And for reasons, good or bad, that are now lost to history, he fell off of the family tree. But I know better than that. Having studied a little bit about how family systems work, which some of you may be familiar with, I realized that his physical absence could not remove him from an important role he played in a family system that I inherited. that all of my family inherited, whether we named it or saw it or not. So for good or ill, his presence and the long family response and reaction is somehow still embedded deep in the core of those of us who came sometime after him. He remains, in fact, a close ancestor despite the effort to push him out of view. It's true for our personal ancestors, as I describe about Uncle Otis, but it's true also about our spiritual ancestors, I think. Who we are today as a religious movement has been shaped by the hands and minds of our spiritual ancestors. Those that are known and those that are forgotten, those who we look back and think of as incredibly enlightened, and those who we think now were slightly misguided, shall we say. The reality is that most of our ancestors, whether they're personal or spiritual, somehow have to remain in part strangers to us. Who they were and how they lived and what they believed are all somehow still present and real in our collective lives, often in ways we have a hard time tracing back. The same is going to be said, of course, of us, those of us sitting here in this room. After a few more generations, knock on wood, come into this world and populate the future. And as humbling as it is to think about it, for all we have done, we will be strangers in large part to them. And their ancestors, as we are their ancestors, will have a lot of influence subtly in who they become, even if they're not able to always detect our presence there. That's what ancestors are for. I kind of think of them as a kind of happy haunting. But more about that in just a few minutes. But first I want to say just a little bit about the role of the stranger as it relates to some of this. The notion of the stranger is an important archetype in mythology, and also as it has a role in religion. In Greek mythology, one of Zeus's names was Xenios Zeus, the protector of strangers. And when Odysseus returned to the kingdom of Ithaca, shipwrecked and alone and disguised as a beggar, his former servants greeted him this way. They said, "Stranger, it were not right for me, even though one meaner than thou were to come to slight a stranger. For from Zeus are all strangers and beggars." Countless other tales and folk tales and stories are told of a stranger figure who comes to a group of people and invites them somehow to discover something important about their hearts and spirits that transforms them in ways that they would almost have pushed away if they could. We can look back to the Hebrew Bible and read about Abraham and Sarah outside of their tent. There they were welcomed and given refreshment and offered rest. And later, the strangers announced that Sarah, pushing 90 hard, would give birth to a child, a son. Only later is it made clear that these strangers actually are angels of the Lord, as the story is told, sent to convey and fulfill a promise that God had made to Abraham. And they were welcomed as strangers. But it was only when they were revealed as angels that Abraham and Sarah started getting nervous. Strangers they were accustomed to. Angels, that was something different. And then in the New Testament, a central core message of Jesus' ministry was, of course, to care for the stranger. In Luke, there's that post-crucifixion story where Jesus appears as the stranger to his apostles who had doubted his resurrection. They asked this stranger to stay with them, to eat and drink with them. And through that act of hospitality, they came to recognize the stranger among them who blessed and broke the bread they would share. In both of those stories, the truth that was brought to them, that was borne by the stranger, could have easily just passed them by, been missed by them entirely. The stranger is somehow the needed element here, required to somehow bring about a breakthrough of trust or faith or understanding, if you will, that moves us to a more complete and fuller sense of who we are in the human family. Maybe the stranger is an angel, or maybe the stranger is a god, or maybe the stranger is a person sitting next to you here in this church this morning. That stranger has the capacity to be a guide to you, to each of us, through a kind of a door that leads to that essential realization of how we are connected in this life. Strangers, in a way, guide us toward the kind of growth that we are often not so ready to take on. And of course, that's another good reason we often have for sending them packing. Most of us like our cozy cocoon of life a little better. In the Hebrew letters, the writer reminds us, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Well, you know, there are those who would argue that Unitarian Universalists come by strangeness naturally. Many see our movement as a wacky assortment of pagans and atheists and secular humanists and other theological misfits who can't meet the muster in mainline religion. When I hear that, I have to confess that I'm filled with a sense of astonishment. Wow, they really do understand us. This is a meeting place of strangers. We offer a place of hospitality to those who live in a sometimes hostile world where their very essence is challenged. And it's nothing new in this church tradition which we represent, this church of the strangers. And I use that metaphor as more than just a convenient tag to describe our own gatherings of diversity and differences that exist in most of our congregations. Actually, this is going to be a minor history lesson of sorts, because the Church of the Strangers was a part of our own church tradition, in fact, that dates back to 16th century England. It's something we actually don't hear very much about, these ancestors of ours who are long forgotten but are very present in how we are as a religious movement. I want to talk just a little bit about those spiritual ancestors and the way they help us understand where we are and what we try to be today. During the Reformation, continental Europe was caught up, as we've all studied at one point in time, with a lot of change within the church. And this change allowed for the growth of new religious institutions and ideas. Of course, as we know about the Reformation, that was not necessarily an easy path. People found themselves attached to stakes above burning fires often, which wasn't so spectacular. But the impulse and drive toward these new institutions and ideas of religion were powerful. England avoided a lot of the ferment, at least until Henry VIII broke with Rome over the issue of divorce and established the Protestant tradition also in England. And after those years of establishing that, and this tolerant, or more tolerant, I should say, atmosphere in Britain, many of the heretics who were on the continent of Europe came and found their way to England and brought with them their unorthodox and heretical notions that the Reformation held, brought them to English universities and English religious institutions. And these people who came this time, though, were not like the earlier invaders. These were not Catholics, and they were not of the Church of England, of course. But by 1550, so many Protestant refugees had come into England that the king finally authorized them to authorize a religious worship after their own manner, it was said. So these dissidents, these strangers, these exiles, organized under the name the Church of the Stranger. And for a brief time in England, they flourished as a community of many languages and of radical religious thought and diversity. These were surrounded, though, by the orthodoxy of both the Catholic and Anglican churches. And so that's what makes it all the more amazing that they were permitted to do what they did, even encouraged to open this theological and doctrinal debate in this really time of turmoil in the spiritual realm. But later on, not too much later, when Queen Mary, who was a Catholic, came to the throne, the Church of the Strangers was actually disbanded, formally disbanded. And they were sent to strange new lands, as it were. And these theological notions that they wrestled with, that can be traced down into contemporary Unitarianism and Universalism, these ideas were driven underground within England, where they stayed and fermented for the next 100 or so years, until another age of tolerance would arise through the Enlightenment. These things, these powerful ideas, as we all know from history, you may sort of rub out the messengers, but the message somehow stays alive. Some of us wonder if what they experienced back in those times is something parallel to what's happening today in our culture, where we seem less and less tolerant of strangers in our midst. Just consider for just a second how we wrestle with the whole idea of immigrants coming into our country and how frightening so many people seem to cast that notion. So because of that kind of shift, some of us think that the liberal church has maybe even a greater role to play in resisting those kind of establishment of orthodoxies, whether they're political or religious or social. It ends up being the strangers among us that remind us over and over that that is actually our true and deepest calling. Like this Church of the Strangers of which I speak, we've emerged as Unitarian Universalists from a historic tradition, but we are constructing now something new. Most of us in this room, I'm guessing, are Unitarian Universalists by choice. The vast majority in almost every congregation I've ever known are in some ways exiles from religious traditions that have ceased to somehow nurture our souls. Some of you in this room, I'm guessing, are far, far away from your family tradition from which you were raised. And perhaps even at this very hour have people praying for your souls. I figure it can't hurt myself, but, you know, take them from wherever they come. It's pretty unlikely that anyone becomes a Unitarian Universalist by accident. And that brings about a kind of intentionality to our deep commitment to find the full and broadest sense of what it means to be religious people. Like the Church of the Strangers, when we come together in places like this, we speak a language that isn't necessarily understood by the larger communities in which we live. It's something more subtle, though, than our concerns for inclusive language, perhaps, or the kind of imagery we may have of the divine. It's often more powerfully reflected in that question that we have so often heard, but what is it you believe? What is it you believe? People have a hard time understanding that ours is a language of the seeker and not of the proclaimer, which is a swap from, as we know, most religious traditions. We seek something time after time, day after day, to consider perhaps what religious texts might mean in the light of challenges of the world we live in today. We trust somehow this evolving and emerging nature that truth holds and question any idea that seems to be preserved from any kind of doubt. And like the Church of the Strangers, at our very best, our doors remain open to those around us who've been ostracized or exiled by forces that are at work in our larger culture. In the 1950s, some of you perhaps were involved in churches that were safe havens for those under attack in our culture as communists. In the 60s, war resistors found sanctuary in our churches. In the 70s, women seeking spiritual empowerment found a place for that in our congregations. In the 80s and 90s, our churches took the ecumenical lead in refuting any kind of notion that the AIDS crisis was somehow God's retribution upon its victims, and took an active role in embracing these strangers who lived among us. But unspoken in all of this is the theological diversity that has been allowed to develop over time. And sometimes I know we Unitarian Universalists can get kind of trendy, but usually, and after 30 years in this work, I realize that those trends, well, they go the way of all fads in this world. How many of you have a mood ring at home? A mood ring. A fad that was popular and is long gone, amongst a few others. Our common religious life isn't dependent upon the refinement of one set of beliefs, but rather on this recognition that we share. Vast power is found and drawn from all of the ways that every single person encounters and engages what we see and name as true. As our 19th century forebears acknowledged and proclaimed, revelation is not sealed. It continues to be found and discovered and claimed and owned and honored. Strangers will always surround us, of course, no matter how hard we try to distance ourselves from them. They're going to exist. And from what I gather before today is over, some of those strangers will become friends as a number of people go to attend this memorial service that I've heard about this morning. People whose lives are normally not interacting with each other, don't have any overlap or exchange, will find one in this moment this afternoon. And something about the stranger will teach both sides something more profound about what it is to care for others. The spiritual pitfalls of failing to acknowledge those bonds and those connections mean that our vision will somehow always remain somehow partial and incomplete. When we choose to engage with the stranger, we cross a boundary that we have accidentally, maybe even inadvertently set for ourselves. A boundary that keeps us from entering a territory that is going to challenge us and that could possibly even change us. In ministry, the people who have reshaped my heart and have torn open my narrow vision are actually some of the people I might have preferred to avoid. People who were strangers, at least to my way of knowing the world. But over and over, it's been made clear, at least to me, that it's only through those kind of risky encounters with the unknown that I've come closer to the mystery that holds me in my place in life. Only in having those encounters with strangers have I encountered God and felt the full embrace of the holy. Whenever I have the opportunity to prepare a worship service for one of our congregations, I imagine, as I'm working on it, that there will be someone in that congregation that will be there that day for the very first time. I imagine that there will be someone who has summoned their courage and maybe answered a promise to themselves, or just can no longer squelch the curiosity any longer, and found their way into our midst. Now, I don't know you all well enough to know if such a person or persons is here today. If so, welcome. in getting here, you've done your job. Your next assignment, if you're today, is to come back a few more times. And our task is to find you, the stranger among us, to learn about your journey, to honor your hard-earned wisdom, to receive your challenges to us, to embrace the holy curiosity that makes you who you are. And if we do our job right, as I know this congregation has a history of doing, the once upon a time stranger will realize that somewhere along the way, something of our treasure has been handed into their safekeeping. And at that moment, the stranger will be a stranger no more. May it be so.
And be unconnected. And join me in our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are there again. Amen. Blessed be.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.